I want to introduce two other people before I turn the program over to Pete, and these are two of my colleagues, just to share a little bit with you, and we won't do this every time, so this will just be a kind of a first and out time tonight. But Bob Schwartz and Tony Frost. Bob is our global operations leader for our applied innovation exchanges around the world, and Tony's our AIE director here in New York. So let me have them come up, say hello, say a few words, and then we'll get the program underway.
I didn't know it was my one and only chance, Lanny. I didn't have anything really prepared. It's not like an open mic night. I'm happy to be here. I work in San Francisco and New York. It's super cool. I'm looking forward to the perspectives on that. We've been part of this series for a while. I'm part of the Applied Innovation Exchange. I happen to work in both locations. I'll let Tony talk to you about New York. But we have a platform of these globally. So New York's our latest edition, and this series, which actually started in San Francisco, has amazed me. So I just want to put out a challenge to you. I was blown away with the questions that came from the audience in the first What's Now that I attended in San Francisco. I was like, okay, I might be the dumbest guy in the room when I heard the first 2 or 3 questions. So that's what we really want to create is what are the innovative topics we want to discuss here? Bring that person that you think would challenge this group, bring them to the next session, and we'll kind of build that network out of interesting people that are interested in helping ourselves, our client, our society innovate in a way that's interesting, and we'll have a great discussion. But I'm part of our San Francisco and our New York teams. I support, as Lanny said, our global platforms. If anybody wants to hear more about that, talk to me later. I'm excited for the program. Tony?
Thank you. I'm equally unprepared, but pleased to be with you. No. Thanks, Carlos. Well, checks in the mail. I'm very pleased to have all of you join us here tonight. As Lanny said, I look after the Applied Innovation Exchange here in New York. This is, I think, our 15th, depending on how you count, innovation lab on the global platform. Being a Silicon Alley denizen myself for over 20 years, of course, I think this is the most important node on the network, but I'm interested to hear what Stephen has to say about East Coast, left coast, and it's an interesting mix I see in the audience tonight. I also have to say I really love the Wired magazine connection because I ended up in digital because I found the first copy of Wired magazine in my father-in-law's bathroom. And because my girlfriend now wife, didn't care at all about what her father did, she neglected to say that he was a pioneer in computer science. So it never occurred to me to ask him why he had this magazine. It was just brightly colored and it said pop culture, and I thought I should understand it, and I didn't, and it made me mad, so I subscribed. And cut to 20 some odd years later, and now we get to work with Pete, which is pretty great. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the work that we do in the Applied Innovation Exchange, please hang around afterwards and ask. And other than that, I will turn it back over to Lanny to kick the night off.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Thanks, Tony. Yeah, on our second floor, and again, if you want to hang out later, we'll be happy to spend some time with you. Our second floor in this building is our Innovation Center. So the AIE is co-located with Fahrenheit 212, and we're doing some amazing things down there. This program tonight is actually being simulcast in San Francisco and in Toronto at our exchanges there. So we can wave to our friends there if you're so inclined. The last comment I want to make, which is so New York versus San Francisco. I was saying to Pete, we've done, I don't know how many What's Now in San Francisco. We've done a lot of them. And rarely will one of our speakers even have like a bottle of water up there, but periodically they do. But this is so New York, so thank you, Stephen, already. We got the wine, we got the iced tea, we've got the food. We'll probably have a slice of pizza up there before this thing's over. But again, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here, and we look forward to a great evening with Stephen. So without further ado, let me introduce our partner in What's Now, Pete Leiden. Pete.
Okay, thank you. Actually, we don't. We can just take that way. I'm Wired here. Well, we got enough kind of intro there, but there's a couple things I just wanted to mention that actually there's deeper roots to this gathering than actually he even talks about, going back 2 years with talks with me. And that actually goes back to Stuart Brand, who, for those of you, many of you know Stuart in kind of the legendary innovator of the West Coast. But Stuart, among many things, he was the Whole Earth Catalog founder. He was now the Long Now founder, among others, co-founders. But he also founded a thing called Global Business Network. And GBN was this outfit that actually, particularly through Stuart's curation, kind of believed in actually that Margaret Mead quote, that kind of never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And Stuart actually really started, amongst with some of the other founders, to create a network, a cross-disciplinary network of really innovative brains around the world. It included people like Brian Eno. It included here Esther Dyson, who's in our audience here. Her father, Freeman, the physicist. I mean, it was a really eclectic but really amazing network of folks that would come together to really put their brains on trying to solve complex challenges that nobody else could figure out half the time. There's some GBN kind of people in here, which we'll get to a little bit later. But one of the things that they actually did was, besides building this network, was they had a thing called GBN Presents. And every so often, they'd have some innovator from one of these fields to kind of give the update of what was happening in that field right at that time that had implications for other fields. And over time, what we started to do is cross-pollinate an interdisciplinary network. And that's the thing what we're trying to do with What's Now. What's Now San Francisco, or What's Now New York Now. And that's essentially every month we're trying to get some insight from a field and get the latest thinking, not the kind of canned talk coming out from somebody, but what is the question they're wrestling with? What is the field wrestling with now? What has big implications on other fields? And then we bring people from that field in with that speaker, but also we cross-pollinate over time with all these other fields. And that's what we're trying. It's been so successful in San Francisco now that we've really said, let's spread out here and let's connect the networks out here with the networks there. And the perfect person to help us launch this out here is Stephen Johnson. And Stephen is so perfect because he's bi-coastal, has a house in both sides. He literally did one of these for us, in which he, because he was a local there, we actually had him in there, and he actually has held one of these, and it was really fascinating. In fact, Stuart Brand and others were in that crowd, and we had a fascinating conversation. The piece of this that I also want to emphasize is GBN always did its stuff behind closed doors. We think that's unfortunate, and so we video everything, we get it out, it's live streamed, but we'll later edit this. Everyone's on camera. The conversation, half this conversation is going to be with you. What you say, what you ask, what you think is as important as what Stephen and I are going to be talking about here, but we're going to set the table a little bit with some kind of thoughts to kind of stimulate the broader conversation. The conversation today is we're trying to understand the differences and the similarities between these two amazing innovation hubs of San Francisco and New York. And with that, let's have Stephen come on up.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. This is, you rarely see this kind of turnout on indictment day. It's very, normally that really suppresses turnout because people want to,
What a day. Yeah, what a year. Well, now the other thing you got is you all have a book. You are the first people on the planet to get the paperback edition of his latest book, Wonderland, although he's got a new one coming out here that, I guess, can you say what the word is now, the title of that?
I don't think we're talking about the title.
Okay, that's true.
It's a book about...
He has no one coming.
Yeah.
But, which we might, there might be something come out of that. But this is the book that's just come out. And
In paperback, it's coming out next week, basically, in paperback.
Yeah. But one of the themes about this that actually applies to this theme is this notion of play, how play made the modern world. And that was one thing we were talking about preparing for this, about how play plays into one of the differentiators of East-West Coast innovation. And so, I don't know, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be appropriate to just say a word about the book since it's out there. And I signed every single copy there. So they're worth like 35 cents more than the retail price on eBay if you sell them now with my signature. So yeah, Wonderland is a book about kind of building on this book and PBS series I did called How We Got to Now, about the history of innovation. And it's making this argument that there is this force behind human technological progress and other forms of human progress that we don't appreciate enough, which is the force of non-functional curiosity, play, delight, wonder, the pursuit of things that just seem amusing or interesting at first that don't seem to have a clear, high-minded purpose, but that over time, as people explore them and explore kind of new possibilities, end up triggering these big breakthrough ideas in technology or in science or in politics or in other fields. And so Wonderland is kind of a survey of a number of fields that were transformed by this pursuit of play and wonder. But one of the stories in it is that connects directly to where you started is a story about the early days of computing. It's actually a kind of an East Coast Bay Area story because it really starts in Boston. It's not a New York Bay Area story. But in the early days of computing in around 1961, there were a group of engineers at MIT who had gotten word that they were going to get this new machine that they were really excited about, the PDP-1, which was some people may remember it, it was considered a mini computer, which was ironic because it was the size of a Sub-Zero. And what was really important about this device, in addition to it being computationally faster, was it was the first one that they'd ever had that would have an actual monitor, so they could actually move pixels around on a screen, at least in this lab at MIT. And so these folks are sitting around trying to figure out what they're going to do with this, and how are they going to kind of build a demo to show the kind of power of this device. And they decide that what they're going to do is they're going to build a game. And so they create this game called Space War. And Space War was basically a kind of, an antecedent of what became Asteroids. People remember Asteroids, so like basically the first video game that I ever played in an arcade in like 1977. And you had in this version, you had two little ships that would fly around. There was a sun at the center of it, and you would kind of shoot each other. And the sun, the star, had actual gravitational force, so you could get sucked into it and stuff like this. And you can play it actually at the Computer History Museum in Silicon Valley, in Mountain View, I think. They have an old PDP-1, and you can actually do it. I brought my son down, and we played it last summer. And it's this very basic game, but to this day, it's still kind of hypnotic. And what ended up happening is that Space War kind of took off. And the code for Space War got copied from one machine to another, and it became really one of the first examples of kind of an underground open source software project where people started adding new ideas and refining the code and making the physics more realistic. And somebody built a little routine called Expensive Planetarium, which recreated the night sky, in actual accurate constellations and things like that. Totally gratuitous, but just what the hell, it was cool. And people built controllers. So some of the first kind of equivalents of what became the mouse were built to control your on-screen avatar in this game. And so you can look back at that history and say, there's an argument that Space War is one of the most important pieces of software that was written in the 60s. And eventually, it caught the attention of Stuart Brand, who was at that point, running the TRIPS Festival and starting the Whole Earth catalog. And I talked to him about it once, and he was like, I saw these people playing this game, and it really was, the only thing I could compare it to was people on acid. Like they were sitting in a room, and there were people around them, but they were just lost. They were just kind of like, oh my God, laughing and everything. And so he got really interested in this, and it was at a point where you had this general consensus that computers were this very square, straight thing that belonged to the military, that had come out of the military in some sense. And so to see people, who started to look more like hippies, who were playing this game for fun and wasting hours doing it, seemingly was interesting to him, Stuart's always attuned to kind of new ideas. So he ends up hosting the first intergalactic Space War Olympics at Stanford, and he gets Rolling Stone to pay him to write an article about it. And in watching these people play, he begins to realize that our whole understanding of the computer is wrong, and that people are going to have a much more emotional, intimate connection to these machines. They're not just going to be big mainframes. And so he coins the phrase personal computer. That's a Stuart Brand coinage, inspired directly by Space War. And then he writes this essay for Rolling Stone that begins something like, computers are coming to the people, is the opening line, and then the next line is, that's the best news since psychedelics, because it's 1972. But whatever, and that's part of the story too. And that article then inspires another young hippie in the Bay Area to go and work for Atari, which is trying to turn Space War into Asteroids, and eventually does. And then he gets bored with that and goes off and starts his own company. And of course, that's Steve Jobs. And so the whole history of, where did we get the personal computer? Where did that come from? When we tell that story, it's often told about, well, there was this guy, Alan Turing, and he was trying to crack these codes, and there were these big military things, and there were big business and IBM and all these things. And all that's true, that's part of the story. But it's also the story of people mucking around in pursuit of fun, stumbling across new ways to amuse themselves that end up opening new doors of possibility. And And then people like Stuart coming along and seeing the possibility there and evangelizing it in a kind of powerful way. So Wonderland is filled with that story, those sorts of stories.
And many stories like that. Okay, so we got Stuart, who could be this anomaly, but how representative is that of a different kind of innovative brain out there from out here? Or I'm just trying to tease out some differentiations that you have observed. I mean, many of you people are bi-coastal, I'm sure you go back and forth, but this is a guy who's kind of lived in both really deeply and spent a lot of time with innovators on both coasts. And I'm just curious, when you think about it, what are some of the things that strike you as different?
Yeah, I mean,
particularly out
it's
there?
interesting. I mean, my experience, so I lived for 20 years in New York, always loved it out there, had a lot of friends out there, and then kind of had my midlife crisis where I was like, I must spend some of my life in the Bay Area. And I kind of forced my wife and the children against their will to move out there. But it ended up being a great thing. And then as I was out there, I started to miss some things about New York. And some of my old friends, a bunch of them are here. And so we figured out to kind of carve out this life where we try and live in both places, which has been lovely, and it's a great opportunity for us. And I sometimes, when we first moved out there, my wife was like, people are so different here. I'm not sure if they're my kind of people. And I was like, look, they are different. But the difference between people in Brooklyn and people in San Francisco, compared to anywhere else in the United States, is really not that different. If you're talking about, so I don't want to kind of exaggerate this. But what I noticed was basically these kind of misconceptions that each hub kind of had of the other, and interesting ways in which going from one and living in one and kind of immersing yourself. And for instance, one of the things that I think has changed a lot since I first moved out there, that I wrote a number of pieces when I was out there trying to kind of, as basically a New Yorker kind of living abroad in the Bay Area, I tried to kind of defend the culture out there, which one of those things was this meme that had developed in part because of Wired, actually, and this maybe is not the best part of the legacy of Wired, that the Bay Area was this hotbed of libertarian politics. And I think that was really misleading. I mean, there are interesting kind of libertarian strains and things, and there certainly are Peter Thiel-like figures who are that. But I think that we've now started to come around to realize that if you just look at the votes, that Santa Clara County is one of the most left-leaning counties in the entire country, and you have this actually very unusual situation in the history of American politics where the absolute hub of new wealth creation, hyper-capitalism, like capitalism at its most advanced, is also one of the most left-wing places in the country. Normally, you have more conservative forces where all the monies are gathering together. In this case, you have it kind of reversed. And I think that that misconception coming from the East Coast, that they're all just Ayn Rand fans out there, when in fact there was this really interesting new kind of progressive politics that was getting developed, obviously very forward-thinking in terms of climate, now very forward-thinking in terms of things like universal basic income. There are a lot of, and obviously in terms of the environmental movement, I mean, there's just a lot of important progressive ideas that came out of that culture. The tech culture, part of that, but the wider Bay Area culture. And the other thing that I noticed from my kind of East Coast friends is when I first told people that I was moving, one of the things you would hear that's kind of the standard line, you'd say, I would say like, I'm getting older and I need more natural beauty in my life and I want to go on hikes and all those things that 25-year-old Stephen would have been like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what even is a hike? I don't even know what that is. And people would say, like, well, New Yorkers would say, like, well, yes, I mean, it is beautiful out there, but like the culture, like, won't you miss all the culture here in New York? We have so much culture. And it's kind of like, well, yes, we do have, in terms of like number of musical events or like ballet performances per night, New York is incredible in that sense. But if by culture you mean where do the new ideas that end up changing societies emerge first. A lot of them come out of New York, for sure. But you think about a city like San Francisco that's a tenth of the size of New York, and a metro area like the Bay Area that's the, sixth largest in the United States. if you think of the cultural influence that that kind of urban footprint has had on the world, technology, yes, but gay liberation movements and medical marijuana legalization, the environmental movement, organic farming, now electric cars. I mean, per capita, I would argue the Bay Area is the most culturally influential place in the world. Now, New York is probably more influential, but it has 10 times as many people. And so that was one of those things where I was like, well, there's a lot of interest in the kind of Bay Area culture and trying to understand why that happened there, why you had a kind of a smaller town. There's this study, famous study that a lot of you are probably familiar with, Jeffrey West did over a number of years with a bunch of people where he looked at kind of innovation rates in cities. And there's this phenomenon, which is pretty striking, that he calls superlinear scaling in cities. So as cities get, one city that's 10 times bigger than another city, by a lot of measures of innovation, whether it's patents or startups or creative work, the city that's 10 times larger is actually 30 times more innovative. And so the bigger you get this extra payoff in innovation. So it tends to be why major metropolitan capitals, London, Paris, in the 19th century, New York in the 20th century, have driven new ideas and change and startups. The Bay Area, with a much smaller footprint, managed to perform kind of at that level. And I've always found that kind of interesting and somewhat misunderstood, I think, by the East Coast. On the flip side, I think there's, and again, this has improved too. I think that both cultures have gotten closer to each other, mostly triggered, I think, by the fact that I became bi-coastal. I think I was the primary glue that has brought them together.
I like it.
I think there is an interesting sense in which it has always been a little bit weird that the tech hub for the entire world of Silicon Valley took root in what is effectively a suburb. And I think one of the things that there are a bunch of people here, like Ken Jordan, some other folks here who were part of that original Silicon Alley scene here, and that I was a little bit of a participant in the 90s, and Esther was part of that world, very much so. And I think one of the things that we all felt at that point is that actually, as the technologies get more closer to media, and as they get more social and they get more about humans interacting and they get more kind of creative and artistic, actually developing them and building the companies that will develop them and building the informal networks that will kind of push them and put them onto a bigger stage actually is something that is better done in dense urban areas. And that historically, when we've had creative revolutions and new ideas and new forms of human expression, they tend to emerge from dense city neighborhoods. And there's something a little bit weird about people driving around, in Santa Clara County, living in their cul-de-sacs and creating this new revolution. And what's ended up happening, of course, is that so many of those companies are now gravitating into San Francisco proper, somewhat destructively for the real estate market in San Francisco, and in Berkeley and in Oakland, and it's become you've got Twitter and Salesforce and just a whole host of companies that have decided to be in the city for very clear reasons, both because that's where their employees want to live, and also because I think they recognize that that's the kind of environment that a company like that should be in. And so it's become more urban in that way.
So we can actually, when we open this conversation, I'll be interested to get other people's hits on this, but there's a few things we want to also continue to get out here. So now the tech world is in this total backlash.
Yeah.
And part of the backlash is coming from kind of East Coast intellectuals, you could say, Franklin Foer and others. And what do you make of this? What do you make of that, basically?
Yeah.
And what's kind of happening here? Because it's a live question, it's happening right now. But these two kind of hubs are starting to get repositioned a little differently.
I think that's right. I mean, I think, if there was a certain sense in which some of people that I admire and publications that I admire and have written for in New York were not fully getting what was happening and what was happening with the politics, particularly out in Silicon Valley. I think the same is true now in the sense that the tech culture out there, I think they're coming to grips with it now, but I think they have underestimated how big that backlash is proving to be. and how seriously it needs to be taken. And obviously, you know, the Trump election took what had been a kind of a growing kind of murmurs of discontent with what was happening, and suddenly became this real crescendo, where people could say, you know, something terrible has happened, and I feel like somehow the internet is to blame for this. And it activated a whole host of other, made people see, I think, it brought to light a lot of problems that were out there with this kind of the recent developments on the internet. I think that some of that is overstated. I mean, I think that to see Trump as kind of the culmination of some part of the internet, which there have been a number, I mean, The Guardian has run like 3 or 4 pieces that all kind of end with like, and thus the internet has inexorably led us to Donald Trump as president of the United States. I mean, they're really like, it's a big refrain. And I think that's wrong. I mean, I think it's an open question whether Trump's Twitter account has helped him or hurt him. Like, I mean, something like 80% of Americans think he should get off Twitter. Like, it's a very unpopular part of his. Now, did it help him get out his message early? But I still think Twitter it's a toss-up whether it actually helped him or hurt him. But Trump is an absolute creation of New York tabloids, the Howard Stern show, reality television. I mean, he is an old media monster. Who just somehow got on Twitter. You know, I mean, I really think so. And so if you're trying to figure out, like, what are the native political forms that something like Twitter leads to, I actually don't think it's Donald Trump. Like, I think the things that are unique on Twitter, and they're sometimes overblown, but they're hashtag #MeToo and hashtag Black Lives Matter and hashtag Occupy Wall Street, all of which began as hashtags on Twitter. Like, those are important social movements that started literally as hashtags and then turned into other things. That seems to be much more indigenous to what Twitter has brought to politics than Donald Trump. So blaming Trump on the internet, but all the other things that are there, the potential for the potential for kind of electoral misinformation chaos, the tremendous consolidation of both power and wealth in the big tech companies, in Facebook in particular, the attention issues, what the advertising business has done to our constant desire to refresh and click and see what's next. All those things are real, and I think we've all kind of grown up enough over the last year to realize that the E.M. Forster kind of always connect mantra that was the center of the like Zuckerberg ideology, right? Which is like, if you just connect people, on the whole, the world will be a better place. And I think we've lost the faith in that appropriately. It's not that simple. There are good ways to connect people and there are bad ways to connect people. And so it's not whether you connect or not, but how you connect, and you have to think about that architecture.
Well, there's the social media thing, but I would just add one other piece that I just wanted you to comment on. It's really this critique of the concentration of power of these platforms.
Yeah.
And essentially, particularly with automation on the horizon here and AI, you know, the potential for really massive disruption.
Yeah.
And so there seems to also be an East Coast, West Coast differentiation around how much disruption is good disruption.
So
to say about that.
Yeah, two things on that. The first is, I mean, it was interesting. We were talking about just the language we were going to use to describe this event, and I was kind of saying, like, you know, we have to recognize that I think there is in New York and in parts of the Bay Area for sure, 5 years ago, you could kind of host an event and say, we're going to talk about innovation, and just 99% of the people would be like, great, innovation is good. We want innovation. And disruption, sure, that sounds great. We want to disrupt things, it's great. And I think there is now a growing sense that, well, okay, innovation to what end? And have we pursued kind of this culture of constant innovation without spending enough time safeguarding ourselves against the potential outcomes or the unintended consequences? I mean, one of the things that both Wonderland and How We Got to Now are both about again and again are the unintended consequences of new ideas and innovations, where you set out to do one thing and it turns out well, you solved that problem, but there was this ancillary effect that killed off this other industry or did something else. And so and I feel like that as someone who's written a lot of books about innovation and partially makes a living talking about innovation, I've definitely spent a lot of time kind of preaching to those choirs, but I think there is a sense among the choir that maybe that song is not quite as, universally a force for good in the world the way that it was before. But the other thing I want to say, and I'm working on a long piece about this right now, about the concentration of power.
I was going to nudge you there.
Yeah, so the question is kind of what went wrong. If we think that there was this kind of earlier phase of the internet and the web that really had some lofty ideals, and that was about this kind of decentralized new media landscape where different voices were going to be heard, and you weren't going to have these big monolithic old world media companies and the old broadcast model. And we've ended up in a situation where, in a way, we have more concentrated power. If you think about Facebook, it has 2 billion users, right? No single private company has ever had an audience, so that's bigger than the entire internet was, 15 years ago. And one person owns 50% of the shares in that company. So that is as concentrated both in terms of wealth and in terms of power, in terms of information power, as any form we've ever had, I think, in history. And it grew out of this, what was supposed to be the exact opposite of that. And I think Zuckerberg, I don't know him at all, but I think he seems like a very, well-intentioned, very smart guy who's trying to do the right thing, and his heart is in the right place, but he's kind of built something that I think is fundamentally at odds with where his values are. And so I think the way I've tried to explain it is that basically there was an initial period where most of what happened online was largely shaped by and supported by open protocols that nobody owned. And so the early formative days of the web, you had TCP/IP, you had email protocols like SMTP, and then of course you had HTTP, and then markup languages like HTML. All these things were systems that nobody owned, they were not the property of a private company, that enabled permissionless innovation and all the things that we celebrated back then, because they were all addressing needs that required universal standards that really lent themselves to. It was really nice to be able to have one standard for email, so you could just email anybody on the planet. You didn't have to be like, oh, I have to go log into CompuServe to send something to my friend at CompuServe, or one universal address for pages in the form of the URL. Those are the kinds of problems that really require some agreement across the planet on what the standard should be. And so once we had those things, we were able to do all these amazing, lots of wealth was created, all these private companies. But there were other standards further up that it turned out we wanted to be able to establish that were also kind of universal standards. And the most important ones of those were identity and the social graph, like who I am and who do I know. And it's really useful. The reason why we have passports and social security numbers is the ultimate proof of identity, is because it's really useful to have one thing that anybody in the United States can say, this is my passport, this is who I am. And so we had this need, but we hadn't defined open protocols for that. And so the market kind of swept in and offered a bunch of different solutions. And because there was this kind of increasing returns phenomena where we settled on one standard, that standard effectively became Facebook. And we now have the social graph more or less defined by this private company. And so really, in a way, you have to see the internet in a sense as kind of two primary layers, using the word stack that everybody uses, kind of stacked on top of each other. And an open layer that continues to work and that continues to be amazing, and then this higher level layer that is less functional because it's built around these closed standards. And say just one last thing. The best thought experiment for thinking about this is, imagine what would have happened had one of those open protocols that we take for granted not been created. So the best example I think of, it's interesting, this is all new material, so let me know what you think of this, is what if there had been no GPS? So the ability to describe, in some standardized way where you are or where your restaurant is on the planet or where your car is on the planet is one of those things where it's like really nice to have a universal standard for determining your latitude and longitude with some precision. imagine that U.S. military had not developed GPS and released it for consumer use, during the Reagan administration, actually. Nobody would have noticed for a while. People in the aviation industry would have been like, well, it'd be really nice if we had some kind of satellite system, whatever. But then, starting with navigation systems in the 90s, and then as people start to get GPS aware, the potential for geographically kind of aware devices in the 2000s, a kind of a market signal would have gone out that said, hey, if you're a private company and you throw up a bunch of satellites that can determine where people are, you might be able to make some money doing this. People will use that. And so there would have been a bunch of rival firms trying to become the standard for describing where you are. And then one of them, because the market would have, just like with Facebook, would have gravitated towards one single way of describing where we are because it's just more convenient that way and more efficient. That company, let's call it GeoBook, would have emerged, and then you would have one standard, and initially we'd all be like, oh, this is so great, we can, just like with GPS the first time around, we'd be like, just GPS will tell me exactly where, GeoBook will tell me exactly where I am, that's fantastic. And then GeoBook would have started selling advertising based on your location, and GeoBook would suddenly have the actual physical locations of 2 billion people around the planet, and there would be a whole host of angry books written about this surveillance state in the sky, or this one company that knows where everyone is in the world and how evil they are. And they would have been right to write those op-eds and books, because that would be scary. But it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because we had an open standard for that. And so we were able to do lots of different things with GPS, and no one kind of concentrated power around it. And we don't appreciate, it's like the dog that didn't bark. You don't appreciate these like missteps or abuses of that power that could have happened.
Oh, you're jumping into this? Did you have a question? Oh.
I mean, seriously, the geopositioning.
Do we have a mic here, quick?
Yeah, I mean, we have latitude and longitude. And so there would have been competition. I mean, what made Facebook so attractive was people gave it their own, not their own location, but a lot of other data.
Yeah.
And it was the connections among the people. But I mean, the physical location is not patentable or copyrightable.
That's right, and that's why the invention of latitude and longitude was a great moment in history, those
tremendously
standards.
important.
But I mean, like the actual, so actually building the GPS satellites would have been a thing where, and when you use a location-aware app that is trying to figure out where it is, whose satellites are you talking to? Are you talking to GeoBook satellites? Are you talking to Google satellites?
It doesn't matter, because they would still be using the same latitude and longitude for your position.
I think that people would start to coalesce around the same bunches of satellites. Maybe that's wrong.
I mean, it's worth discussing.
Yeah,
later, but
But what we could do, just to frame this a little bit in terms of the concept of what to do now,
Yeah.
is, and I don't know, I don't want to be unfair here, but I'm trying to wonder, there's a kind of, do we legally break these things up, kind of regulate them? And I don't want to get too characteristic here, but let's say there's at least an East Coast kind of way to think about that. It's happening in DC right now. And then there's a technological way to deal with this, which is through blockchain and a couple other things. And without getting too geeky here, do you want to talk about how one level of innovation, you could almost go more innovation to solve this problem, or kind of legal ways to solve this concentration of power?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Do I want to talk about the blockchain? Is what you're asking me.
This is what this story's about.
In front of these very smart people to start talking.
Maybe give a general idea. In
Well,
other
look-
words, there's another way to reboot the internet, basically.
Well, here
on blockchain.
So as part of this piece, I had this really interesting conversation with Chris Dixon, who's written about a lot of these interesting new startups, who himself has bounced back and forth between New York and San Francisco. And he made a really good point where, like, even if you had wanted to create an open Facebook in 2007, it would have been really hard to do it, technically, because you would have needed, what Facebook effectively runs is this unimaginably vast database that tracks all of our identities, all of our connections to people, the social graph, the history of our likes, the history of our images that we've shared, and all that stuff, and then an equally vast database of advertisers who are trying to target other people. And that universe of data, even if you kick out the advertisers because you're not thinking of it as a private company, that's an incredibly expensive enterprise to run. I mean, I don't know what their infrastructure costs are, but they're obviously like billions and billions of dollars to run all that. And if you were looking at this problem in 2007, the question would be like, well, who, if we want an open, non-proprietary social network, who's going to run that database? Like, literally the cost of it would drain the accounts of the Gates Foundation after 10 years, right? I mean, it would just be billions and billions of dollars a year to kind of maintain all this technology. It'd be really hard to do. And there wasn't really a distributed way to maintain a database. That you couldn't have a nonprofit, you don't want a government agency running a successor to Facebook or a rival to Facebook. That wouldn't make sense. And so it just, as an architectural problem, it was really hard to figure out how you could do it. It just was something like the original telephone service back in the day. Like part of the AT&T argument was it's really useful to have a universal nationwide telephone network, and there's no way a bunch of distributed companies are going to be able to do this. It has to be one company. I'm sorry. Let us have this natural monopoly because this is the only way to do it. And so there's a similar thing at the time with Facebook. But what has changed since then is Bitcoin and the blockchain. Basically, that we now have an ability to build distributed databases, distributed ledgers, whatever the kind of language is, where there's no central authority that is saying this is the correct account. No one has messed with this in any way, and it can reside on servers all around the world. And through this complicated coin token mechanism, there's a way of incentivizing people to maintain the database, and it seems pretty secure. I mean, Bitcoin has been around for a while. If you actually could hack Bitcoin, you would walk away with billions of dollars, and no one seems to have been able to do it yet. And so we have this distributed consensus trust software architecture that we didn't have 10 years ago. And so what is starting to happen is all these people, under the kind of craziness of the Bitcoin bubble and all the froth of that, and all this talk about cryptocurrencies and investing in them and all that kind of stuff, beneath that, there is this architectural advance and a growing number of people who think this is actually the way to get the web back to its original roots and build systems that are truly decentralized, and also systems that end up distributing both control and economic value more evenly, including that kind of holy grail of the Facebook-style system where early power users actually participate in the value creation and actually see some of that. So it doesn't all get captured by the founder, the people around him, the early investors, the early employees. It actually gets shared by people in the wider ecosystem, even people just using the service. That's the dream, right? Whether it's actually going to happen or not is another question, and it's probably beyond my conceptual abilities to tell you whether it really is going to happen. But there are a number of super smart people here, as much as in the Bay Area. There's a big crypto world here. There's a really interesting thing called consensus here. And so I think that's the alternative to the kind of regulatory antitrust intervention, that you just need to break up big tech. Maybe there is a seed of reform coming from within the tech sector.
Can you not hear this?
Yeah, no, you threw a name out there and I missed it. You said an example here is...
It's a kind of an organization called, and one of the things that happens in this world is the boundaries of what the organization is are being kind of reinvented itself, but it's called Consensus with a Y, and they're in Brooklyn, and they just did a conference. They're developing on the kind of Ethereum platform, and that's as much as I'm going to say about cryptocurrencies.
It's starting to leak out here with people wanting to talk, but let's get Mickey here. Just wants a quick one that's related to this, and then we're going to do one last thing and then swing it into full-throated discussion here. Huh? Yep.
So I'm also fairly bicoastal, and there are a couple points that I wanted to kind of raise with you, Steve.
Great.
Because I know you're also a historian, and I'm very sort of aware of some of the cultural differences between the two of them, and I think you have to look at history. Silicon Valley is founded around the military-industrial complex in Fairchild.
Yep.
This place is a power structure of media and finance. And for many years, all the money, all the power in the valley was in the valley because all those people needed manufacturing space and, frankly, little Vietnamese fingers to put together integrated circuits. So that's the first revolution. The reason San Francisco is now powerful is only because we've moved from hardware to software and into the internet and cloud technologies. And that's the phase at which New York and the New York metropolitan area becomes important, because that technology disrupts both finance and media.
That's a great point. So I just add one more thing to that, which is,
I think that's right.
I think that's absolutely right. The military, the whole history of the military in the Bay Area is fascinating, and so much of it is shaped by the actual like geology of the bay itself, right? That you have this like really interesting geological event that happens that creates this amazing harbor that's the only thing like it on the entire coast, and thus was seen as a very logical place where it would be invaded, and thus there's this outsized military presence there, and then that combined with the great universities leads to things like Fairchild. So you can take it even further back. But I would say that there was also the seeds of that in Route 128 and in Boston and in that kind of first generation. And what really made the difference was the collision that happened between really three poles: the academic culture, the military kind of engineering culture, and then the counterculture. And it was the collision between kind of Fairchild and Stuart Brand. The homebrew computing, if you look at the pictures of the homebrew computing club, it is a Grateful Dead concert. Like, it is literally like, you know, you can't have that story of Jobs' life without just, he didn't wear shoes for 3 years and only ate fruit and all these crazy things. I mean, that was such a part, and he dropped acid and all these things that were so part of the vision. And that's why, this is my theory about why it ended up working in a suburb, is that one of the big things that dense urban areas normally provide is many different kinds of diversity, but one of those things is kind of intellectual, professional diversity. You have mixed-use neighborhoods, all the Jane Jacobs stuff. You get people with different perspectives hanging out, and it's the collision between all those different worldviews that creates new possibilities. And what Silicon Valley had, somewhat uniquely, was in a suburban environment, these three distinct cultures that actually collided with each other that were very different, but through that collision created something that was incredibly powerful, and was still living with the kind of aftershock of that collision.
One question before we're going to go to everybody here is, and we kind of teased it in the frame of the whole event, and I just want to say this. I mean, we're going through a crazy moment in American history and world history. Brexit backlash, Trump, climate change hitting in a way that, you know, is finally just starting to be really catastrophic. When you see, we're talking about these tensions between these two hubs. I mean, to what extent can these similarities,
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent is New York and San Francisco gonna, and the areas around them, I'm not just literally talking about those specific cities, to what extent is there almost a responsibility right now to kind of connect up and really elevate the innovation that's going on, to really start thinking like fundamentally differently about how the economy is organized and how, you know, we distribute wealth, and how we really organize. I mean, a lot of people in this room will probably be thinking like that, you know, oh, of course we got to deal with climate change radically, but, you know, honestly, we haven't seen that kind of dramatic, kind of big swings coming from either place yet. Although I will say California state politics is getting pretty radical out there, and maybe there's something similar out here. But anyhow, just your thoughts on kind of the responsibility or the opportunity, maybe?
Yeah.
Given where the country is now, to kind of do something really different and
Thanks
kind
for
of
giving
join
me such an
forces.
easy question there at the end
Sorry about that.
of the night. So by the way, Pete has written with Roy Teixeira this really interesting series you're in the middle of that's worth checking out about basically how in many ways what California as a state has gone through politically. There's an eerie way in which it's about 15 years ahead of the rest of the country. That they had their like right-wing television movie celebrity governor in
Literally
Schwarzenegger.
15 years
Literally
before.
15 years ago, they had a big anti-immigration backlash. They had a lot, they had a lot of things that are eerily similar to what we're going through now as a nation, and they have good news. They have recovered their senses, and it's not just the Bay Area. California, as a state, at least along the coast, is now even Orange County, the old hotbed of Reagan Republicans, is now very progressive in a lot of ways. And I had this thought, like, after I wrote this piece for the Times, after the election, where I went back and looked at, I kind of tried to put together two numbers, one of which was each state's relative, each voter in each state's relative power in the Electoral College, given that the Electoral College is set up to give more weight to smaller, more rural states versus big states like New York and California. And then combine that number, which a lot of people have complained about appropriately, with the number on kind of tax revenue versus government spending, right? How much is each average voter in each state spending in taxes, and how much are they getting back from the federal government? And of course, as all of you probably know, the wealthy urban blue states pay more in taxes than they get back in federal aid. The poor, rural, largely red states pay far less in taxes and get more money back from the government. And if you combine those two things, you get this situation where states like New York and California and Massachusetts and Washington are really, in a way, as I said in the piece, the real Tea Party, right? Because they are getting, they're paying more taxes for less representation. And that's the argument that we may be, the Times was just arguing this the other day, that we may be moving towards this kind of permanent minority rule because of the way that the Electoral College is set up and gerrymandering and all these other forces and the concentration of progressives in big cities, that we may be moving into this world where we had the people, if you just poll the American people, they believe that climate change is real. They think immigration is a good thing. They believe in all these ideas that most of us in this room, I think, share, but we just can't win because the rules of the system are kind of rigged against us. And it was the first moment where I was like, oh, maybe California will secede. Maybe because I can't see anybody, I just don't think we'll reform the Electoral College. I think it's gonna be really hard to do these things. And I think eventually people will just tire of losing. And California will be like, we're the 8th largest economy in the world. Is it 6? Yeah, Jesus. 6. Yeah, okay, there you go. And so, why are we even bothering with this if we don't get an actual real say in the matter? And then I was joking with you the other day that I had this kind of vision of both coasts, Northeast and the West Coast, seceding and joining Canada. And I was describing it as it was like the sideburn secession. Imagine Canada is this big mop of hair, and then the coasts are kind of the sideburns. But I mean, for the first time in my life, I could imagine 50 years from now, that the kind of as people kind of reorganize around cities being the kind of in their metro areas being their primary. One of the thoughts I had the morning, and then let's open it up because I'm rambling. But one of the thoughts I had the morning after the election was, I woke up and just looked around and was just I kept repeating to myself, I am a citizen of New York. This is my primary, I'm here in or even better, I'm a citizen of Brooklyn. This is my geographic identity. I'm not, and I don't feel like an American today. I feel like someone who lives in New York, and I can live with that. And there's a lot of different positions and opinions within that role, but within that geography. And I think that there's a chance that just gets more and more exaggerated, and we start to say, why do we have this giant, larger national organization? All right.
With that, let's open it up. Thoughts? I know there's some Californians in here and there's some New Yorkers in here, but thoughts of all the provocative kind of points that he kind of laid out there? Love to kind of flesh it out. We got in the back here. And just, will you stand up and, no, way behind the end.
And say who you are.
Yeah, say who you are. Stand up, put your name, and if you want some kind of affiliation or what you do.
A long biographical sketch.
No, just a phrase. But
I was born June 2nd. So my name's Adam Trisk. I've been in the innovation space for a long time. I work for Elephant Ventures, where we do digital innovation and transformation. I think one of the things that I've noticed most about East Coast, West Coast is that it fundamentally parallels the kind of adventure that started New York and the adventure that started the West. And so if we think about, burgeoning out into the West to go and find gold, we look at New York, it's a highly structured, very efficient environment. And what I've noticed is that the folks who pursue innovation in New York happen to work in very structured, linear fashion. The folks on the West Coast are just there to figure shit out. And so it's this kind of adventurous, by any means necessary, let's figure out, let's get together, let's bring people in. And I think New York has a lot to learn from that environment. And I think on the same side, that environment has a lot to learn from creating structure so that it's not just a free-for-all, but it's a really different parallel whether you work, and I've literally done innovation work sessions in both sides, and you can see that. You have this young group of very aggressive people who work for Google by day, who do freelance capacity work in the evenings, and they just want to do great things. And New York is a totally different type of environment. So I'm curious to know what your experience has been on those two.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it, I think. I mean, I guess, the one thing that pops in my mind that I really didn't realize until I moved out there, and I'd never been, but I talked to a million people about it, and I have lots of good friends who spent a lot of time at it, is how important Burning Man is to the Bay Area culture. I mean, it is really, so many people from the very, from Elon Musk and, Sergey, all the way down to the crazy guy you meet at a bar. Like, they're like, oh, I was just hanging out with Sergey at Burning Man last week, and, like, it was crazy. We built this huge, animated float, and we did all this stuff. And it is the kind of major, I mean, this is not right. This is exaggerating it, but I kind of was like, oh, like the way that the media culture in New York talks about the Hamptons, like the Bay Area talks about Burning Man, and like they're kind of different, and so I just was really struck by that, and you can.
Well, tell them what Stuart is.
Oh yeah.
Like
This is
Stuart-
we're
other
going to bring it all back to
Stuart
Stuart Brand. So when we first moved out there, I had dinner with Stuart and his wife, with my wife, and kind of halfway through it, he said, "Have you been to Burning Man?" And I was like, "Oh no, I know. I have so many friends who've been so many times. I got to do it. I got to." He's like, "Yeah, you really got to do it. You got to, and also you got to bring the kids. It's so great for the kids." And I was like, no 76-year-old guy in the East Coast is being like, take your kids to Burning Man. Like, that is not, but it was, apparently it's great. I mean, you said you
I brought my kid when she was 6 and 10, and she loved it. She said it's like, all the adults are like kids. It's awesome.
Just one last, we'll stop talking about Stuart Brand, but I love this story. We went out to his farm once, and we brought our kids, and Stuart had a new drone, and he had a new kind of boat there was a kind of amphibious boat, and he took the kids out on this and did all this stuff, whatever, and then afterwards, we were driving back, and my middle son said, "That's the youngest old person I've ever met."
Let's play. Well, actually, we have
Yeah.
someone who actually worked on the Burning Man staff. James, do you have any thoughts on that reflection here? Do you want to stand up and introduce yourself?
So James Hanusa, I happened to be in New York for the last, it's turned into 2 weeks, a one-way ticket to DC. I've stuck around to see what can be done. This gentleman actually gave me a call, about a month ago, I guess it was, and we started talking about small island nations. And this DC trip was then meeting with the World Bank and the World Economic Forum and IEEE, was ostensibly about Puerto Rico and connectivity, building a new connectivity core to go help get that infrastructure back up.
Yeah.
And so, I've been ping-ponging through meeting to meeting. He called because of the Burning Man background and all the kind of base of my hierarchy of needs, right, that are being needed there, and the alternative technologies and structures and all that Silicon Valley has piloted at Black Rock City.
Yeah.
So, the thing with your Bloomberg background, you're talking about bringing it back together and reinventing America. This is like, to me, almost the perfect storm in if you could bring, Google's got their connectivity blimps above Puerto Rico right now. Elon's promising
he's building-
power walls
He's
and
putting some of them in already.
yeah. And I'm sure you guys got some firepower at Bloomberg as far as recreating cities and spaces. I think that combination of creativity and boots on the ground. This came up in the IEEE meeting too, there's a conversation that's being had with the boots on the ground, and then there's a conversation with the politicians and the investment community, and they're missing each other somewhere.
Yeah.
So I'd be really interesting to see if that could be, a test bed, right? Who was talking about the test bed where, you gotta have safe space where creativity can flow, and then that can be, daisy chained out to nodes where demonstration projects or others can, people can get a sense of what the future looks like, what the future feels like. And I'm not saying that's Burning Man. I'm saying that we could bring the expertise of Bloomberg and all the mayors that you guys are in touch with that, the high-tech community out there and the burners out there to places that really need it. If that's Puerto Rico or if that's, somewhere in the center of the country somewhere.
And you've got $300 million that was just
Totally right.
Oh,
There's a woman right here, and there's some other people popping up here. Yeah.
Thank you. Eleni Janis. I actually work for the city of New York in the part of the city where we invest in building ecosystems, or at least helping people build ecosystem and advance industries. So just a couple of thoughts actually on the politicians' finance missing each other. Like I could not, second that more, and really think about reinventing and redefining the U.S. infrastructure marketplace, as I want to call it, which may be just the more traditional language of thinking about infrastructure. But there's just so much opportunity that technology brings, right, with smart cities, and so much private capital interested in finding outlets actually in this space. So definitely politicians and government has to do better there. And I would say actually it's, test the solutions in cities, not in the middle of the country, but test them in New York City, test them in big cities where, some of them apparently are, it's possible, and in some cases a Burning Man environment may be better for that. I wanted to go back also to the conversation about New York City versus San Francisco and the culture, and just a couple of thoughts. One, not generally about the culture in California, but specifically maybe in tech, right, and maybe 20 years, but something that we definitely see and we're trying to change here and hopefully will change is that a lot of the entrepreneurship and innovation in San Francisco, or maybe all of it, is financed by entrepreneurs who exited, right? Who by very risk, by capital that has a lot of risk, appetite for risk. While in New York City, the development of the tech ecosystem here has been funded by much more conservative, risk-averse capital. And that's slowly changing, and our hope is that it will change as we have more exits happen here. But just like that, wondering, your thought on that. And the second, I would love your opinion on one of the things that we like to promote, and we see is the openness for ideas here. I don't know, maybe they're not as, I guess, I don't want to say as big, but if there is a cultural element to, there is the openness in our culture here, and the openness to ideas from different people and diversity of people, which is just a reflection of how diverse New York City is, and the openness of the ecosystem. So we always, we say that, but we also hear it from others that it is a unique value proposition of New York, of the clusters that we have here, and how easy it is to go in and out of networks and meet people, and people who are open to ideas. So I would love to hear your opinion on how does that play out. And I'm talking about openness to ideas, not just big ideas, but also ideas coming from different types of people, like diversity in backgrounds, whether it's ethnic or even just professional backgrounds.
Yeah, it's a bunch of great frames. In some ways, you're just thinking about the way you were setting it up and your comments about Burning Man and applying them in other places. In some ways in California, it's like there's always this echo of this idea that we could create a whole new world, or we could create a whole new community kind of from scratch. And that is almost literally like an echo of 1849. There's like, we're just gonna go out there and create it all from scratch. And then that becomes the communes and Stewart, and that becomes virtual communities and the well and all that kind of stuff. In New York, I think one of the things that's been amazing to see is how much, I went a little while ago actually when I was doing the podcast for Wonderland, and spent some time at the Etsy offices in Brooklyn. And Etsy is just like that, embodies what is so great about the scene here. And the thing I loved about it was, the first off is the embrace, where I think New York has been really in the lead on this, in the embrace of the benefit corporation structure, the B Corp structure, which some people are aware of here, which is this really interesting thing. It's been championed a bunch by people like Unisquare Ventures, as well as some of their companies. And Kickstarter is a variation of B Corp, Etsy is a B Corp. And the idea is that these corporations can have an actual structure that allows them to not just maximize shareholder value, that kind of constant refrain, but do that, but also pursue other kinds of social good as part of their kind of charter. And that's just having that legal structure so that you can say, we're making this choice because we think it's right for the community or the world or the planet or whatever it is, not because it is actually purely for the bottom line. That's something that I think you're pretty sure it's fair to say you see more of that here than you do in the Bay Area, and I love it. And the other thing I love about something like Etsy is I think about this a lot with just talking about innovation. As I go around and talk to companies about how do we get more innovative, how do we get some of that tech sector kind of feel, they're all like, oh, don't they have foosball tables at Google? Like, we need foosball tables. Like, we just give the people foosball tables. Like, suddenly they'll be innovative. It's like, that's not going to work. But what Etsy does instead of that is like they figured out like what is the more playful side of this organization that is actually true to the spirit of this organization. And what they decided was it was music. And they're basically, Rob, who founded it, was a big musician. And if you work at Etsy and live in Brooklyn, 95% chance you have an indie band that you're also in at night, And so the space is filled with musical instruments. And there's like a grand piano in one place, and there's an actual recording studio we can go in with like an isolation booth where you can record stuff, and and there's guitars everywhere. And the culture is like, let's do this meeting, let's work on this, and then let's go jam for like 20 minutes, And it's beautiful. Like that's an authentic environment that creates this openness to creativity and people's hobbies and their outside world, but that doesn't feel like, well, we bought you the foosball table, like why aren't you being more innovative? And I think that's what that's what you get. That's where get back to that. The kind of self-parody of like, well, what about the culture? Aren't you going to miss all the cultural events? Well, you do. I mean, that is one of the things that New York has going for it, and the fact that everybody's in a band and they have all these, and there are just a million venues to go to, and every night you can do these things. That too is a big recipe, both for creating great work environments, but also just creating great spaces, creating great cities. And that's a big part of what I love about this book.
Okay, we got one here, and okay,
Hi.
go ahead. Just can you introduce yourself? Yeah.
Yes, sure. I'm Anshu, and I'm actually from Santa Clara County.
There we
Yeah.
go. Good.
And I'm an ex-Facebooker, so all the
Okay.
examples to use. So I'm just curious to understand your perspective. I appreciate this conversation, especially sitting in New York and getting a hang of how people think about the West Coast. I feel on the West Coast, what do you think is the inflection point where it went to a point like it is now ingrained as a place where tech innovation happens and money fuels more of that? Like somebody said, there's more risk investment happening over there, which rewards Facebook, Google, Airbnb, Uber, great examples. Do you think that, does East Coast have to be that? I mean, East Coast is all about finance and media, and the careers on the West Coast at finance just get to a ceiling very soon. Unlike tech careers where you can be anything. In my perspective, I've seen that when Bay Area really started to get saturated with talent, space, money was still abundant. It was Austin and Seattle which started to see the spillover. It still didn't come to New York as much, and even Colorado now. So is it a very what do you think is the reason that New York may not ever catch that whole, and should it? Is my question.
Yeah, I think there has. I believe New York is now the second biggest hub for. The second biggest hub for tech behind. So there's been a lot of progress. I think the question is, could you just be kind of comfortable, and we should, because we are so much bigger than the other places, so it would be logical that we could still be underperforming relative to Austin and Seattle, given our population size. But I think there is a sense that, we all now have come around. It's the old Mark Andreessen line about kind of software eating the world, that like basically once you move into the digital economy or the networked economy, like everything, it's impossible not to be transformed by it and to kind of be like, no, we're just going to keep our magazines here and control them and not play in the software world. That just cedes decision-making power and innovation power to the folks who are working on it in the West Coast or in Austin or wherever. And so I think, you want, and both in terms of the underlying code, but also in terms of the interface layer too, right? Like how do we make sense of all of these new information networks? And on that layer, there's a lot of experience that New York has in terms of the creative arts and visualization and things like that. So I think it would be a mistake for the city to just be like, hey, we've got all these other titans of industry. Why do we need to play in that world? And I think the fact that we have made so much progress and we have some great new hubs, places like this, and then the naval yards over in Brooklyn near Dumbo, which I haven't been over to, but sound kind of amazing. And it's just all these spaces. Again, interestingly, like, the classic Jane Jacobs line of new ideas need old buildings. There's a version of it which is like new ideas need old military bases. Like, you know, like they make really great spaces to take over, and that kind of the shell left by the military is a big part of both cultures in some ways, and I think we'll see even more of that.
We're going to do a few more questions, and then there's plenty of time to also hang out and have some more drinks. But go ahead here. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Paul Schreiber. In the last 100 years, we've done a ton of innovating, and we know, for example, it's much better to get energy from the sun than to pay people to burn coal. And we know that first past the post is kind of crappy way to elect people. And we know that, you know, having this super complicated tax form where you pay a bunch of people a lot of money to sort of do it is bad. And we know that dense urban cities are great. But we aren't adopting all these innovations because people are super change averse, or there's all kinds of regulatory capture. So how do we have wonderful innovation? How do we get this more widespread and better adopted?
That's even harder than the question that Pete. No, but do you want to ask another one first, or?
No,
Okay.
you can answer.
Can I please dodge that question? No. So I'm writing about this a little bit in this book about long-term decision making. And
Which shall not be named.
Which shall not be named, but it's coming out next September, and it's just going to be terrific. So it is frustrating. I hear you. I feel your pain. I feel it too, right? But one of the points I'm trying to make in that book is that despite the fact that everybody says we live in this kind of short-sighted, you know, attention deficit kind of culture, and we're making all these kind of stupid, short-sighted decisions and so on. On the other hand, we're doing things now and regularly making decisions that are actually contemplating a 50 or 100-year time scale appropriately and thinking about, you know, kind of the impact on our descendants in a ways that we really weren't doing 100 years ago, right? So every time you decide, I'm going to buy this electric car versus this, or I'm going to buy this, you know, low carbon footprint, whatever, detergent over this one, you're like making a decision in that moment that is factoring in the level of carbon in the atmosphere 50 or 100 years from now and what that will mean for the planet, right? No one buying consumer goods 100 years ago was thinking on that level, right? They were just like, well, this is cheap, but this works, or this doesn't work, right? And so, and the better example of this, I would say, is the debate we're having about artificial intelligence and superintelligence right now that's starting, that also is partially coming out of the Bay Area. We're talking about a problem that we don't have yet, that we won't have, most people believe, for another 50 years. But we're sitting there thinking we've learned to think about it, we've learned to see how these technologies developed, and we've seen the unintended consequences of early mistakes we make in defining these things. And so we've said, let's have this conversation now so we don't deal with downstream consequences that are really disastrous or potentially an existential threat 50 years from now. Now, we're not very good at thinking that way. But that's a new way of thinking, right? People design for cyclical 100 or 500-year events in terms of weather, right? They're like, okay, we've seen the floods every now and then get this big, so we need to build dikes that can handle this or whatever. But anticipating unprecedented problems or emergent problems that are down the line, you know, 2 generations or 3 generations is something I don't know of any example of that in human history. So it's like we're at this point where the frustration is partially because we're even trying to do something that no one dared to do before because we couldn't make forecasts like that. We just weren't smart enough to even think on that level. And the fact that we're really crappy at it right now, and a lot of people are not making the right choice, or we're unable to get societal consensus that something like climate change is even happening, and that we have the current administration denying it, literally like rewriting, that's a sign that it is hard. But we should remind ourselves that we're trying to do something that we haven't ever
I
tried
would just
before.
add one thing. I know there's a couple of last questions here, but I will add one thing that the other way to think about this is that the level of innovation our society is heading into now, weirdly, is like civilization level innovation. That we're not really just, that the juncture we're in here, that's kind of the Trump and the Brexit backlash and the kind of retooling the global economy. And we've never had an all-digital world. We've never had a totally globally interconnected world. We've never had climate change like this. I mean, these things are like, you know, and the old, tweaking the old policies isn't going to work. And so I think we've never experienced this level of challenge at some level. And in some respects, the last time it's almost like the Enlightenment, going back to the level of deep innovation they went through back then, when in broad cloth they invented representative democracy, or they invented financial capitalism. Anyhow, it's a broader conversation, but I think there's something we're losing, is that by not reframing what we're really up against here, that, hey, it's hard to design a global civilization,
Right.
that's going to work. I don't know if you share that
It
feeling.
is definitely hard.
Yeah, there's somebody here. Couple last questions, and then we're going to have plenty of time for people to drink and talk, and he can sign books. Go ahead.
I pre-signed them. I can personalize.
Personalize.
There we
exactly.
go. I'm Elizabeth
Could you stand up
Tallerman.
and say?
Sure, I'm Elizabeth Tallerman from Nucleus Strategy in Brooklyn. And I want to have you comment on, we've heard a lot about risk and play, east and west, public and private, optimism and agency versus fear and victimness, or even proximate versus existential threats. So as we think about Puerto Rico and Google sending up blimps and Elon Musk doing power walls, this is a very selfish question. I'm sitting here trying to figure out, how do you bring cognitive diversity and public and private and East Coast and West Coast together to deal with nuclear threat, when it's an existential threat to almost everyone born after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But to those of us born before that, it's a very real and proximate threat. How do we think about play and risk? The idea that Google and others aren't jumping into the fray because it's not a fun topic.
Interesting. And does it go?
We're going to do.
Yeah, no, go ahead and answer that. I'm just.
Okay, yeah.
experts
Well,
teed up, and then
it's
we're
a great
gonna-
question. I don't know if I have the best answer, but I think that, and we've chatted about this a little bit before, that, before Trump, I always had a lot of problems with people saying the kind of default attitude of like, oh, we live in really contentious and dangerous times. That you would hear all the time, like, well, it's a dangerous world these days, and it's, and I'm like, what? Like, compared to what? Like, what? I mean, compared to, the Cuban Missile Crisis, compared to 1973, I mean, compared to Manson, compared to the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, just think of the violence in this country that we had in those times. And, I just think, yes, there are more people shouting on television and on Twitter, but there was, certainly before the Trump era, I think there's no question that the 60s and the 70s were much more turbulent, and you had a much more imminent threat from nuclear holocaust that was over everybody's head. And we know that overall crime is way down. We know that terrorism is way down since the 70s. And so that kind of easy assumption of this is a very dangerous time, it's a tough time to raise your kids, all that kind of stuff, I always had a lot of impatience with, and I still do for the most part, but the Trump era has certainly, with Rocket Man and all that fun stuff, it has challenged some of my natural kind of optimism about these things. But I think, it is the one place where, perhaps the North Korea threat has reminded people that this is still a thing that would be great if we could deal with, and that.
Where does innovation fit?
Yeah.
The inventing of the vacuum cleaner or the inoculation to make nukes inert, since you can't.
Right.
Where is innovation?
Well, and the other thing that's very interesting about nukes is, which is related to the AI question, is the history of humans choosing not to develop new technologies is a very interesting and largely very short history. There are not a lot of cases where people developed a new capacity and then said, we can do this, but it's probably best if we don't do this, because and where you put nukes on that, it's kind of like it's kind of halfway between of like, well, we used them twice in war, but we still haven't gotten rid of them, but somehow we've kept them in check for this period. Will we be sensible enough at some point to say, we should just take these off the table? Are we capable of doing that? Again, it's a kind of thing we've rarely done in the past. Generally, the technology is kind of let us wherever it will take us. This is the very Kevin Kelly kind of argument of the technology has its own kind of mentality. But maybe it's time we develop that superpower. Maybe we develop the ability to say no to some technologies. And I don't know how to get to that, but I feel like we're at least trying to have that conversation with a better sense of the history of technology and where it's led us, where it's worked and where it hasn't.
One last one here, and then we'll have some drinks. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Carlos La Madrid. I spent most of my career in the media industry. Full disclosure, I grew up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Great.
I spent many years on the West Coast and in San Francisco. I'm married. My wife is from Sunnyvale. She actually grew up next to Randy Wigington, employee number 3 at Apple.
Oh, wow.
And I've been here in New York for years. And I want to play devil's advocate for a minute. I would challenge everybody in this room and everybody in Silicon Valley or anywhere in California to stop thinking about ourselves as more enlightened, smarter, Trump was a backlash, oh, we know better. Because I actually think that we constantly, growing up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, by the way, I moved there in 4th grade from the East Coast, long story. We are underestimating the American people. And we're underestimating, the American public in mass is busy leading their lives. And when they wake up to something, whether it's technology or something going on in politics or in media, is when sort of the force of the American people shift. We sort of sit here sort of observing the coast, thinking how can we be more innovative, how can we help each other? The reality is there's differences and complements in both coasts. The question really should be, how do we innovate and integrate the American public in the rest of the country?
Yeah,
That's very good.
yeah, that's great.
Any final thought on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a little bit of what I think it's a wonderful point, and I think that that I was alluding to that in some sense when I was talking about taking the backlash seriously, taking whether it's the tech backlash or the inequality backlash or just a sense of the system right now is not working. Okay, yes, yeah, I mean, no, but whatever it is with the criticism, I mean, the sense that the complaint that the way that the current landscape is arrayed is not working on some level or is fundamentally broken on some level, and that there are real complaints there, and that it's not just like, people are just resisting change, or, and that's that can be a coastal kind of attitude on both sides, that just people don't get the new things and they'll come around. And that I think is absolutely wrong. So the question is like, how do you create outcomes where it's interesting and relevant and dynamic and satisfying and life-affirming to people in lots of different places around the country? And again, I don't have the answer to that, but I agree that it's not. I agree that there is a significant part of the Trump constituency that is accurately perceiving something that is flawed about the world right now. I think that there is still much more consensus across the country around a lot of the values that people probably share in this room, those kinds of progressive values. The country is further left than certainly the election results suggest. And we probably overestimate the Trumpist forces that are out there, even in the middle of the country. But there are legitimate complaints that I think, some of which we were trying to address, which is the wealth inequality thing, for instance. But I don't have the easy answer for how you deal with that. We've got a lot of tough questions tonight.
Tough questions, tough time. I tell you what, I think we're gonna have to wind up here because we're just at that time. But what's happened is we got drinks down below, some other food. We encourage people to stay a little bit, schmooze around, talk to Stephen, talk to your colleagues here. A lot of awesome people in this room. And do consider coming back in early December is our next one, and then we're going to pick it up through the year and going into it.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Inaugural. Thanks, Stephen.
What's up?
You can
Now I
drink
can
your
finish
wine.
my wine.